Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to King's College. I'm Annemieke de Jong. I lead the Foundation's Refugee and Emergency team. IKEA Foundation works to ensure that we have a healthy planet to live on and that people at the same time are able to build sustainable livelihoods so that we can all take care of our families in the best way possible. And the team that I lead looks to do this specifically for people who have been affected by forced displacement. This often, of course, is the case due to conflict and war, but we do see increasingly people having to leave their homes and livelihoods behind because of the rapid effects in climate as well. So we're seeing an increased set of drivers making people leave their home and everything behind. Now, you're with us today on World Refugee Day. And every year on the 20th, we take a moment to more consciously think about the people that are forced to leave everything behind, who become either internally displaced within their countries or when they when they move across borders, of course, are into these new communities and countries that maybe are less known to them. And this World Refugee Day. Hi, everyone. How are you? Hey. And this World Refugee Day, we've been able to team up with the London Design Biennale team to actually take the opportunity to think through what it means when we say we're designing for people forced to flee. And so when we say designing from our perspective, as a funder of organizations that works very closely with people, it means what kind of programs, but also the how we fund these kinds of programs. And today's panel will look a little bit more closely at what we know about refugees and migration, but also very much of what we don't know, what we're ignorant about. So I'm going to be handing over to Professor Alex Betts in a second. He will introduce the panel and the panelists to you. Just to say that Alex has been an esteemed partner of IKEA Foundation for many years, as has been Ola, of course. And through him and the team at the Refugee Study Center, we are learning very much about what it means to think through other ways of programming, particularly around refugee economies as such. So we hope you enjoy listening and engaging with the panel today. You might walk away with things you didn't yet know, or you might feel like you need to rethink what you know about refugees and migration, or that you feel fortified in the kind of thoughts that you already had. So on behalf of the London Design Biennale team, my team at IKEA Foundation, you'll see several of us here. Thank you very much, and I'll join Alex on stage to walk us through the panel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event. I'm really excited to be able to moderate this conversation. I'm Alexander Betts, and I've got the privilege to be director of the Refugee Studies Center. As you can tell by how I'm dressed, I obviously don't work in design, at least not in the conventional sense. The focus of this panel, though, is on designing for people forced to flee. So there's a clear link to the theme of the Biennale. But it's really about policy design. And we want to reflect on what it means to stand back, re-engage with what responses, policies, and programs should look like for people forced to flee war and human rights abuses around the world. And I couldn't be more delighted to be able to be joined in this panel by people who combine a huge variety of inspiring work from different geographical perspectives. The way we're going to approach this panel is to have a way of introducing 3 new, exciting pilot projects that are about public engagement to enable people to understand the experiences of displaced people, engage with them, and rethink what it means to be displaced as a route towards the redesign of responses. Those 3 pilots are things that the Gapminder Foundation and the Refugee Studies Center in Oxford have worked on together. And they are going to be the Refugee Misconception Test, which is a way of reflecting on and showcasing public misinformation surrounding refugees and displacement. An initiative called Dollar Street that the Gapminder Foundation has developed for a very long time that's about visualizing the material existence and day-to-day life of people around the world. And thirdly, a project called Refugee Stories, which is rethinking how we combine data and human stories and integrate them. We're putting them out there for you for the first time today. A couple of them have already gone live on the Gapminder Foundation website, and we want to welcome your feedback and reflection. But crucially, we also want to subject those pilots to scrutiny, debate, and reflection. Because on World Refugee Day, it's very common to announce the idea that we have a headline number published by UN refugee agencies, that there are well over 100 million people around the world displaced by war and human rights abuses. And of those, more than a third are displaced as refugees who have been forced across an international border. But what Refugee Day should be about is not just the headline figure. It should be a moment to reflect on the contributions that refugees make to all our societies, what they bring economically, socially, culturally, to enrich every community that they inhabit around the world. And a moment to step back as well and reflect on the inadequacy of the politics and policies with which refugees are supported and in many cases excluded by lack of opportunities to move and lack of opportunities to access rights. And so we want to be able to say, okay, here's a way in which we can think about data and evidence as part of the redesign, but alongside that, we want to subject it to the scrutiny of lived experience. And as a panel, we collectively think evidence plus lived experience are the way to rethink and redesign refugee responses. So the people on the panel reflect that. First of all, you're going to hear from Ola Rosling, who is president of the Gapminder Foundation, about 2 of those pilots that I've told you about. You'll then hear very briefly about a third that we've worked on at the Refugee Studies Center. And then, most importantly, I'll engage in a conversation with 2 people who bring really tangible, lived experience of displacement to the panel, but are doing extraordinarily inspiring work on the ground every day to inspire displaced people. We'll hear from Joar, who has graduated with a master's degree from Oxford in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, is now working with the university and with One Young World in London, and has originally left South Sudan and has experience of Kakuma refugee camp, which a lot of our discussion will focus on, and Summia Tora, Summia Tora, who has huge experience of having left Afghanistan and has founded something extraordinary called the Dosti network that supported Afghans around the world to access resettlement, relocation, and humanitarian access, raising huge amounts of money in the process. What we want to leave you with is 3 core messages, and I want to put them right on the table at the start so it's clear where we're going and what the narrative will be. The first big message is that there is enormous public ignorance about refugees, particularly in Europe, towards refugees outside Europe. The second big message is that in order to redesign responses to refugees, we need to engage both evidence and lived experience that are part of what should absolutely inform government responses. And the third thing we want you to take from this, and this is where my bias as a researcher comes in, that we can rethink the tools by which research, policy, practice, and lived experience work together to be innovative about the way in which human stories and data can contribute to reconceiving and redesigning responses to displaced populations. So with that introduction, I'm delighted to hand over to Ula for the first part, and then we will come back on stage with me, Lam, and Summia to reflect on the broader landscape of responses. Ola, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. My mic is on, right? I actually think you look a bit like a designer. I know a lot of them, and they dress like you, but I don't look like a soccer player. I was playing in a soccer team once. I was the only one there were 2 of us who didn't speak Spanish. Everyone else were refugees from Chile, in Uppsala in Sweden. And my father told me, my father Hans Rosling, who had done a lot of this Gapminder stuff, he told me, you know, the refugees that come, they are the best. It's like the people who struggled and fought Pinochet, and now they fled all the way to Sweden. They're so brave people. And that was so clear to me because I never scored 1 goal in my whole career of 5 years playing soccer. I never scored once. I just thought that maybe you are a designer, but I just started thinking of that. Here are the 2 projects. Ignorance about facts. numbers. I asked 9 fact questions to you. How many of you answered yes today? Can you please raise your hand? I'm very angry with you. I'm very, very disappointed because you didn't behave like I expected. I'm going to come back to that later. But roughly 30 or so answered the results, and yesterday evening we were supposed to have dinner and I couldn't go because the results made me redesign my whole slideshow. Because the conclusions that I expected were not there. I'm going to go through that. We also published the results from 7 countries online in a survey we done with, it's not academic research what we are doing. We're basically looking for misconceptions and giving away the results. So we asked 9 questions, also 2 opinion questions, which you did not see, to try to see if those 16,000 people in US, UK, and you're going to see the list later, Turkey, etc., Colombia, places with a lot of refugees, what they think is the correct answer to the same 9 questions. And we use, yes, the marketing tool called SurveyMonkey. So no high-quality data, no academic research, but fascinating patterns that urge to be investigated further. Here's the first question. You saw this one yesterday. I'm going to look carefully at 2 of the 9 questions. We're not going to go through all of them. In year 2000, around 20% of all refugees were in so-called high-income countries. What was the number in 2021, before the Ukraine war, right? Was it 20, 30, or 40? So we asked this to all the people, and let's look at the data. I'm going to talk about refugees here as including all of these. UNHCR, refugee, asylum seeker, Venezuela migrants, and the Palestinians. So that's the total number up to the year I asked about. It looked roughly like this. Yellow is high-income country, middle-income, and low. I'm going to use these colors all the time. So the question was, did it continue being 20%, roughly like that? Or was it 30? Is it 30 now or 40 now before the Ukraine war? That was the question visualized, right? And here is the correct data. Has been an enormous increase, not just this, I'm going to show the next year a little bit later, but up till 2021, you see this enormous increase, but the share in high income, even though the number increased, which feels like a lot for people in high income countries, a lot of more refugees, the biggest increase was elsewhere, right? Which was another question. I asked about these 4 countries, what happened since 2010 with the number of refugees? It increased by roughly 9 million. And this is completely unheard of, not only in high-income countries. Even when I ask in Turkey, they are aware of this, basically. They were the only ones answering roughly correctly, that 8.3 more refugees are in these countries during the last 10 or so years. This is unknown, but that's like one of the biggest increases on Earth. But if it doesn't happen where the Western and the rich country media is, people just don't know about it. They see it as short pieces of information from Bangladesh or something. Once in a month or something, there is some report. But we never see the numbers, right? So we fail to realize that today, or in 2021, 20% of all the refugees were in these countries. And that's a new thing for the population in these countries, right? After 2021, I'm just going to show the last year with the UNHCR data, there is an increase, and yes, the increase with roughly 5 million in both middle and high-income countries means that today, roughly 25% are in high-income countries. So of course, in high-income countries, it feels like this is now where it's increasing. And if I ask again in 2 years, they're going to answer very, very wrongly. Just look at the world map of, this is the kind of tools we're doing. Gapminder is an educational nonprofit. Everything I show you is free of charge. We give it away. It's used by millions of students for free across the world. And here is a map showing where refugees are hosted. Okay, refugees and asylum seekers and the Venezuelans. Okay, here we go from year 2000. Yes, changing slowly. We can see in 2000, we're going to come to 2015. And you can see the yellow ones are high-income countries. Orange is middle. And as countries get richer, they stop being low income, right? So they change the color sometimes. And we can see the enormous increase 2015 here, right? And let's move forward to the latest data. This is just to illustrate that this is not what the refugee situation looks like in the news. The last year, you can see the enormous increase in Europe there, right? According to UNHCR data, the country that received most new refugees last year was Russia. Enormous increase. But then suddenly the number went down on their website, probably because Russian reported it differently or something. Now they are no longer refugees, they are part of Russia or something. So looking at the data shows a lot of things that we wouldn't see otherwise. So how did people respond to this question? Here are the results. This is the correct answer. Not much change, actually 19%. These are the responses. Most people assume there is an increase, either to 30% or even 40%, right? And this means 81% overestimate the share in rich countries. This is generally any question I ask, like, which country hosts most per capita? Many think it's Germany, because it's a European country. It must be a European country, right? Which is wrong. Lebanon is also very European, but it's not one of these Western European countries. So this is the opinion question. I want to try to break down now. The question is, the correct answer on the fact question, is it connected to the opinion about receiving refugees? So we ask this, should our country, as if we were in Pakistan or Colombia, should we receive more refugees in our country, or the same or fewer than we already do, right? So I'm going to call this opinion the welcome opinion of fewer, the same, or more. And here are the results that we got. In Turkey, 85% said fewer refugees, which is kind of understandable. They have a lot already, right? But we can see how the pattern is different. Here is actually the number of refugees per 1,000 people in these countries. There is some similarity between that and this, but at the same time, look at Colombia, for example, or Kenya and Germany, with the same refugees per capita. Same level of fewer refugees opinions. In Colombia, lots of refugees or migrants from Venezuela. Very few answered like, okay, not scientific research survey, etc., but really fascinating to see. All I'm going to use this for now. By the way, we asked this last week, 2 weeks ago, so it's really, really fresh data. And it's really cheap to do this kind of analysis online now, to test how opinions change when things happen. I just bundle these together now, and I have 3 opinions. These are going to show only UK, US, and Germany, because there we had larger samples, at least 400 people. So how did they respond to the fact question? The people who said we want more refugees, they got 28% correct when they answered this question. Those who said we can stick to the same number of refugees or fewer, you see, when you want fewer refugees, you're going to be more wrong on this question. Basically, you're thinking that US, UK, Germany, high-income country, we already have too many. It's increasing here, right? That's the feeling they have. That goes together with the feeling that we should have fewer refugees. So probably, yes, opinion and fact are somewhat connected. We can see that on the little staircase there. I also asked ChatGPT what ChatGPT think about it. And it was actually more like a more refugee answer, or like Pakistan, quite good. Or actually most of the time wrong, like everyone else, you see, in the world. This is the pattern of misconception, because look at the number, 32% correct. If you ask another population, this one, you give the bananas with ABC, all the questions are ABC questions, right? So a chimpanzee have a chance of 33% to pick the right banana. That's better than all the results I just showed you. So if you closed your eyes and pick an answer without looking at the questions, you would score better in general. That's what we call a misconception. What we need is not education. We need to bring people up to the monkey level. Then it's time to teach. We need to remove the preconceived ideas that they have in their head, and then maybe start educating them afterwards. That's generally what we do, and I expected you to follow that pattern. But you didn't. And that ruined my night yesterday. Here are your results. This never happened to me. I've been lecturing at UNICEF, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, at IKEA Foundation too, actually, and at UNHCR, etc. I come with a package of questions, and there is always like a huge misconception, just like the public. And it didn't happen in this group. Can you just clap your hands? Because you won, and I failed, sort of. I would have showed you that you're worse than monkeys, and I would have told you that you need to learn things before you make decisions, etc. Instead, now let's analyze the public. Like, how can people be so wrong? Because obviously I can't say that you are. Well, by the way, 1/3 of you got it completely wrong. but you're like forgiven because people around you are more correct than the public in general. So rely on your friends. Well, here is another question, because now I want to jump over to there was one question that saves me, actually, out of the 9. It's this one. Well, let's look at the question first. This is the long version. UN spent 6.4 billion. I'm going to call it 6 billion. How much did Western European countries spend within Western Europe? Okay? Did Europe spend 3 billion, 5 billion, or 20 billion last year to help refugees? Okay? So I'm clearly benchmarking it with 6 billion, asking A and B are lower, C is higher than the UN number, right? Okay, let's simplify it visually. These are the options I'm giving you. I'm telling you 6.4, and then I give you A, B, or C. Which one is the right answer? Well, if we guesstimate, if we say, okay, the number of refugees, the cost per day, and the number of days is easy when doing this kind of math in your head. 365 is generally a regular year. How many refugees were they? Roughly 7 million or so. If you multiply 7 by 365, can you just tell me what that is? No, it's tricky with numbers, right? That's why we go with emotions and opinions. If multiplied by 10 then, it's quite easy, 51 billion. That's what we would end up on. Why did I put $20 per day? That is the World Bank average estimate of national poverty line in so-called high-income countries. We don't accept poverty below that, basically. In Sweden and Scandinavia, it's like 30 per day. Any family below that is going to get money somehow. So when refugees come, I assume that's a reasonable idea of what to protect. But this is guesstimation. Let's do real data. Maybe there were fewer refugees receiving a lot of money, only the newcomers from Ukraine mainly. $14 per day, slightly lower, 300 days, because then they started working, right? A lot of the refugees actually got some job. Then we end up on 21 billion. But actually, I have real data behind this. It's not just a guesstimate. 21 billion happened to be 22 billion is what the OECD DAC data, the development aid statistics, published in April this year, saying all these countries reported having taken these amounts from the international aid budget, which was meant to be spent elsewhere, to spend it internally on helping refugees, which is a very nice thing to do, right? Families showing up from Ukraine. I'm not saying that I don't support this, just to make that clear. I really think we should be supporting these Ukrainian families, and I have friends who came from Ukraine. Actually, software developers who developed Dollar Street were in Kharkiv, and they fled. So I know exactly who I'm talking about in that case. Of course, we should help them, right? But we should keep the numbers in our heads, and it's very difficult. So the correct number is at least 22 billion, because look at Belgium. They actually took money from elsewhere. They didn't take the money from the international aid, as UK took a lot, right? A third of the international aid they took for the refugee receiving. Because we're surprised something happens. Where is the money? We grab it wherever it is, right? Correct answer is obviously this one, 20, okay? So here are your results. Ha ha! 11% picked the right answer. That's terrible. That's a really, really bad result. I would love to analyze with you why this happened, because you scored worse than everyone else. Here are the options. Here are the results from the public. This is what I wanted. So this question saved me, and I redesigned the whole slideshow. Because, look, 81% think that the UN spent more than West Europe, right? Which is, I don't know why, probably thinking it's part of the world. We can't be spending more than elsewhere, or something like that. Those who said, welcome more refugees, scored 17 correct. Those who say, let's welcome fewer refugees, got more correct answers. Probably there is an opinion and a feeling that, oh, it's costing too much. Western Europe spend too much, a lot. So they have a tendency to pick the right answer from emotional opinions or something like that. I wouldn't say it's knowledge, right? Here is your result comparing to them. You scored worse than all these groups. I can comfort you, because on all the other questions you scored better than all the other countries. But this one stands out, and it's really fascinating. I don't know exactly what to do with this insight, but that is what our project is all about, finding the misconceptions that are systematic within groups of people. It's often very easy. This one, it was hard. Here is half of you guessed on the number which is close to the UN number, 5 billion roughly. and a third. Like the chimpanzee, just to remind you, would score better than everyone else. So yes, opinions matter, but not so that this group scores better than the monkey. No. We tend to focus a lot on opinions and feelings, but they don't really impact. Look at these 3 different opinions. They are roughly the same in terms of ignorance. So we are having debates where we're pointing fingers at each other, and the opinions maybe doesn't matter much. Here is your results. It's fantastic. All these bars used to be down there. I'm very disappointed. There was someone here who got 7. Yeah, you had 7. So it's an amazing result, right? Almost, yeah, I have very little to teach you. But the public in general scored like this. And this is what I expected, right? Look, they scored 2 correct answers out of 9 possible. 10% managed the incredibly difficult to pick the wrong answer 9 times in a row. A chimpanzee cannot do that, like carefully picking the wrong banana. You need to read the question and basically be systematic. That's why I call it misconception. It's universal. We humans. So we should be curious about this. Where does it come from and how do we fix it? Because we're having a debate about the global development which is not driven by the facts. The difference between Germany, the worst country, and Kenya, the best, is very little. Very little. So we can't even make fun of the Germans because maybe they slip their thumbs when they answer questions or something. ChatGPT, we shouldn't really trust, but it's actually better than the public. So we could, but you, well, it's better than you as well. I'm sorry for that. Different opinions. Welcome more, welcome same, welcome fewer, got the same average result, okay? Same wrong perception, independent of the opinion in general on all these questions. So when we love to call the other political opinion idiots, they don't know facts. I'm correct because I know facts. That's an illusion. That's a waste of time. We better sit and learn stuff. They are equally wrong as us. Doesn't matter which opinion we have. That's in the study. Now I want to move over to the Dollar Street project, which is complementing this, basically saying, what kind of teaching, what is it that people don't see? The media images show what we are looking for, Western European influx, but reality looks different. So how should we show the data so people understand it? The perception was that more than 400 million refugees in the world, correct? These are the wrong assumptions people have, that we should somehow battle with educational materials, correct? People need to realize it's only 46 million or so, not including internally displaced. But it's much fewer than people believe. So it's much more affordable, right? That's an important positive insight. Even if the curve went up, it didn't go up to 400 million, which is almost 500 million, which would be terrible. At least yet we haven't reached that level, right? Most are in middle income. The exile is long and poor. We asked about the length of exile. People don't realize that a majority stay in exile more than 4 years. People don't know that. Here are your results. You see how this question stands out. You scored 11 correct here. On the others, you were better than a monkey on all of them. When I saw this, I almost started crying. Okay? So that's the monkey level. Funny thing here. The question where you scored best and worst are both those with dollar signs in them. This asked about the total billion spent. This is the dollar per day spent. Both of them compare Western Europe and the rest of the world. And for some reason, you picked absolutely great on that one and terrible on this one. I don't exactly know why. Obviously, you're answering with your guts, right? There is no systematic, coherent picture in your head that makes you score correct in that one, because otherwise, because they are actually the same numbers if you start dividing and doing the math, right? The perception and the reality, right? The perception is that Europe spent less than the UN up there. In reality, it's absolutely different. You saw this is a low estimate, right? When it comes to perception and reality about the dollar per day, so I gave you in the question, Western European gave to newly arriving refugees roughly $20 per day. What was it in the UN? Then people, not you, everyone else out there, guess that the UN is spending more per person. This was the per person version. This is completely crazy. This is a super rich UN, more like OECD or something, which has like tons of money. This has never happened in UN history. I think it will never. Like the tax needed to bring in that money is crazy, right? But that's actually what people picked when I asked that question. So they imagine UN as being a rich organization. Everyone we know who work for the UN knows that there is never enough money to do the thing, right? For no UN agency. But the public have a different perception. Fancy flags, men in suits, shaking hands, flying airplanes, lots of money. That's what they see. Nice SDG icons, fancy design, right? Maybe UN should brand itself slightly different. Trashy clothes, bad hotels, right? And like sweaty, no good haircut when you're interviewed. It's like, oh, we need more money. That would give a different impression. But now people actually think there is enough money to save the world. And we know it isn't, right? So you didn't make this mistake. This is the reality. If I take the UNHCR, UNRWA, and divide it by the total number of refugees, this is what UN is doing. That's how people think it is. So when we say we need to bring in more money and give to a UN or an international organization, no, they have enough already. There's a branding issue, I think, or something else. Worth investigating. I'm only showing that there is a systematic misconception. Look at this on Dollar Street, because this is what Dollar Street is. I'll just finish with that and hand over to Alex, who's going to talk more about it. What reality actually looks like is more like this, but the world is not divided in two groups. This is an oversimplification, the rich and the poor, right? There are refugees on this level as well. And that's exactly what Dollar Street does with the world as a whole. Say, Dollar Street. Imagine everybody living on one long street, right? All of us do that. Can you tell me your income, like per day? And I can position you there, and you're going to be neighboring someone from the Philippines, or maybe from not North Korea, but South Korea. Because on one income level are people from many different nationalities. We don't live on our GDP per capita, right? The distribution is huge. If we take the 8 billion people in the world and distribute them on dollar per day, it's like a doubling scale here. You get 4 times higher income, you move up there. 4 times higher income, you move up there. This is what the world looks like simplified, like Teletubbies visualization, right? So we have people in extreme poverty, roughly 1 billion, under $2 per day. And then we have extreme richness, like me. I have 2 cars. Actually, and 2 apartments in Stockholm. We are rich, many of us, right? And they are poor. Yes, they are rich and poor, but most people are in between, trying to get their way up here, aiming for this luxury of life that we experience. Okay? If we simplify it even more, that billion, they have no shoes, right? When they're going to transport and walk from one country to another. These guys might have a bicycle, they have a moped, and they are having a car, and these guys dream of getting that car so they can go on a holiday. Right? That's what the world looks like. This is the big picture. It's not a divided world. When it comes to food, there is food here, not always enough, but not very tasty, and no extra stuff. Yes, the basics. A little bit of extra variation, and we think we're going to die if we're not eating different food every meal. We're like teaching our kids to, no, don't eat that again. You had that yesterday. It's like almost magic thinking about food. This is what you need to survive, okay? And we're like completely obsessed with the variations up here. That's what luxury is, like getting obsessed with the wrong stuff. Here is the world population, not as billions, but if I spread them out, yellow is high-income countries. Yes, there are people living on the streets in US, being quite poor. Almost nobody below $2 who don't have that porridge they can eat in the US, in the high-income countries. And then there is the rich, they go out here, and Bill Gates is living over there together with Bezos. Let's forget about them. Low-income countries actually don't have rich people, so they have no one to tax. So if you want to help the people down there in the low-income countries, there is nobody to tax there, because they are not rich like this. There's no elite. While the middle-income countries, the big hump where 75% of humanity lives, yes, there are rich people. They're actually half of the high-level consumers. And then they have extreme poverty as well, like Brazil, South Africa, India, Indonesia, etc. They have the full range of the world. We don't. In high-income countries, if someone comes here, we say $20 per day is national poverty. We won't allow anyone below it. Because we don't have that kind of poverty, right? So we're very unfamiliar with it. If we look at the refugees' income per day, how the heck do I know the refugee income per day of all refugees in the world? I just plotted it for you. It's a rough estimate. I made a very rough assumption that in every country where refugees or asylum seekers are, they belong to the poorest 10%. So I took the distribution of people, and then I just put the refugees at the bottom 10%, nicely distributed as the poor 10% of the population. And then I stack them up, depending on which country they are in. And you see, in high-income countries, these are Ukrainians in Poland. It is a high-income country, but it's one of the poorer high-income countries. So poverty there is slightly below the Western Europe in general. But poverty in Poland is not poverty in Malawi. It's two different things. The word poor is useless. It means the whole scale. Bill Gates thinks all of us are poor, right? Because anyone below you is poor. Anyone above is rich. So it's important to see. It's almost a normal distribution. But there are almost no refugees here, you see? I think this is the Mediterranean or the Caribbean. You manage to escape from the middle-income country to high-income country. You have to cross this line to get into the other definition of poverty, right? Yes, my rough assumption of the picture. So putting the two over each other, I want to hand over to Alex and say, how can we use Dollar Street images? I can show what it looks like on our website. So it's freely available today, thanks to Clara and Christine, who are my colleagues. Give them an applause. They did the actual work. I'm just a white man presenting and getting famous, like my father used to do. If you go to Dollar Street, which my wife, Anna, created, not me, this is how to see the refugees in Kakuma. You go in and you pick the country. Well, this is Dollar Street, you see. Hundreds and hundreds of families from across the world. And there are no rich and poor. You see the houses up there. They are on all different levels. And anywhere you can go in and visit the home and see what this family lives like, and actually look at all the different physical environments that you would never see in the news, but which is the reality that people live in, right? So if we go back and we actually pick Kenya here, we today launched 9 households, and you can pull the slider of income down to the bottom. I'm doing this live now. These families are in Kakuma. They are down on something like $80, $96 per month, right? So you divide that by 30, you get $3 per day. That was actually not in Kakuma, this is in Kakuma. These are other Kenyan families on this roughly the same income level, but almost all the poorest we have now are the Kakuma refugee families. And in each of them, we're actually gonna hear more from this woman later. But online you can go in and visit her home and go around. And millions of students in classrooms in the high-income end today are using Dollar Street for free, thanks to this funding we have had from IKEA Foundation and others for many years. So we enable students, teachers who are insightful. They say, okay, misconceptions is something I don't want to give to my students. Let's give them reality. And they have a chance then to see what life looks like and do their own comparisons as if they were backpacking, which is very expensive. So in this way, we hope that students across the world will come to Kakuma in a big economic context and see what it looks like compared to neighboring countries and people in other countries living on that income level, and learning about the complexity of the world instead of a simplistic worldview. So I'll hand over to Alex, who will talk more about that. There we go. Thank you.
So these 3 public engagement tools are pilots. They're at a very, very early stage. The misconception test builds on a lot of work, but it's the first time that it's been really systematically applied to the refugee context. Dollar Street builds on something pre-existing, but it's the first time it's been applied in this context. And Refugee Stories is completely new and at a pilot stage. So we really want feedback, questions, engagement. And so Lan, Summia, you have relevant lived experience, as well as doing the amazing things you do in the world. And we'd love your feedback. So Lan, you're the only person on this panel who's actually lived in the Kakuma refugee camps. What from what we've shown you resonates and doesn't resonate with your own experiences of Kakuma?
Well, thank you, Alex. And it's my very pleasure to be here. Yeah, so commenting on the great work that you've done with the Gapminder. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how people who are very open to give you data but I would say it's an amazing work. Most projects that are designed for refugees, Alex, always have the gap because I understand drawing from the past existing research, but I think it's very much important for you as a designer of that project to go to the field and see and also have the experience yourself before you design anything, because there's so many differences when it comes to what work in the refugee camps and what we think is the right thing to be done for the refugees. So growing up in Kakuma, like all these streets that you've seen from Kakuma and Kalobeye is where I partly grew up from. And as you could see, it's a very, very dry place. And including the citizens or the local residents, you can't see the difference between the refugees and, because the place is completely isolated. So without the help of everybody else coming to bring us some programs, it's almost impossible to get out of that camp. You know? So it's always good that a program like this are done, and the involvement of refugees is also very much important. So I would say that the work and everything that I've seen is very much aligned with my experience and very much related. And the fact that people went to the field to do it from there means that most of the things that you've collected are correct. Yeah.
And Summia, there's huge variety in experiences around the world. And I think from a European perspective, we tend to be quite reductionist and assume disproportionately that refugees live in camps, whereas around the world, more live in cities. There's huge variation. You predominantly work with Afghan refugees. You've worked with Afghan refugees around the world, including in Pakistan, Iran, as well as in Europe, in Greece, in the UK. We've focused in a lot of this initial work on Kakuma or at a very aggregate level on Western Europe. What do you think, from what you've seen, would need to be changed, adapted, if we were to also think about the experience of Afghan refugees?
Yeah, so firstly, thank you so much for having me on this panel, and thank you for both of the presentations. They're really great, and I wish, especially with the data, with the Gapminder, I think it's like, I wish we can use that further for specific contexts, and that could inform people's perception. And thank you for sharing the stories, and thank you, Lam, for sharing your story. I think with one of the things that stood out in the presentation and what we've talked about is, I would say, inequity that exists among refugees. And I think that is one thing I would encourage everyone in this room to really think about. So I grew up as an Afghan refugee in Pakistan. My family fled Afghanistan in the 1990s when the Taliban were in power the first time. And although I was born in Afghanistan, I lived most of my life in Pakistan, and I didn't actually know that I was a refugee for a while, for a long time, until I went to school. Because in Pakistan, the refugee migration started to happen from 1980s, and Pakistanis initially were extremely welcoming, and most refugees were able to integrate into communities and actually live in different neighborhoods. They were integrated into the economy, and I learned the local language, so we weren't necessarily confined to a specific camp. And I want to acknowledge that I have that privilege here. And I think having that experience as a refugee, where I saw what life was like as a refugee, being able to access those, I think my perception at a young age, when I arrived to the United States at the age of 16, I got a scholarship to go study at an international boarding school. And I went to New Mexico, so I was at the southwestern border of the United States, which, as many of you might have known on the news, most migrants trying to come from Latin America, Mexico, cross borders there. And for the first time, I started to realize that there were different experiences of displacement, and also different ways people who are trying to flee persecution are treated. And each country, in terms of their policies and law, things differ. And now, currently, as I'm working through my organization with refugees, we work with refugees in Greece, Afghan refugees in Greece, in India, in Pakistan, in different parts of the world. The group of refugees that we work with are those that have sort of fallen in the gaps of what most big international organizations are trying to help with, or the UN is doing. So they don't necessarily either meet the refugee category of what legally it's defined, or they are trying to seek asylum and they're stuck in a situation and they do not qualify for aid services. And the work that we do is trying to address inequity that exists in refugee policies. And I've seen that with how Afghan refugees around the world are treated. I'm sure you've all read about stories of Afghans leaving after 2021, but I want to acknowledge that most of the Afghans who were able to leave and were able to be resettled were either elites or were from upper middle class families. And this is a very important fact to acknowledge. And I go into different spaces and talk about this. Because when I go, I just spoke at the UN. So when I go and speak at these places, it's very easy to give number and data and say, we resettled these many refugees, we helped this family, put the story of a family on their website, oh, we provided them this services, and they're living amazing lives. But if you actually look into what the background of those families were, how they were able to access this, it was because they were already in a position that placed them to be able to access those resources. And that being said, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't welcome such people. We should. But we should also think about how can we make that accessible for the rest of the world. And in the case of Ukraine, I think we have seen that I think it's a good lesson to learn in a sense that we can be welcoming to all refugees from a country that's going through something difficult and open our arms. Yeah.
Can I pick up on that question of what you think European publics get wrong in terms of their understanding of refugees around the world? So, Summia, let's come back to what you said. You've spent a lot of time in the UK, done a master's degree in Oxford, you spent a lot of time in the US as well, but you've also seen the realities faced by Afghan refugees in Pakistan, in Iran. What do we really get wrong across publics in Europe or North America about the realities, not in Europe, but in those neighboring countries?
One of the biggest misconceptions people have is that if they're in the neighboring countries, then they're safe, which is not the case, and that they have access to resources. One fact that we have to acknowledge is that most of the largest refugee hosting countries, as we saw in the data, are countries where there's actually no citizenship pathway. So that in itself is a big issue. Because if you can't become a citizen or you're confined to live in a camp, that affects how you're able to live your life and sustain yourself. So for example, Pakistan, taking the case of Pakistan. So we've been working with refugees in Pakistan, and some of the families that we helped are still there waiting for their visas to be processed. But most Western European countries or the United States, in North America as well, are unwilling to accept applications from these refugees because they say that you're in a country that's considered to be safe, so you're out of risk, and you're no longer a priority. And that in itself is a big issue, because politically, the political situation in Pakistan itself, like there are a lot of people who are internally displaced because of the floods and climate change that's impacting Pakistan. So Pakistan already has a huge burden of its own civilians that are being displaced. And on top of that, they have the responsibility of 1 million Afghans. And as we saw, Pakistanis were more positive in responding, still having more refugees. I think I would want to give them some credit, but I think it's important to realize that even if you're in a country that's considered to be safe, that doesn't mean that you can live your lives and have full livelihoods. And for that reason, it's important to share responsibility of hosting refugees across different nations. And we can also see that from the data that we saw.
It's really interesting that your experiences resonate with the data that Ulla presented about that sense of actually there's a really under-resourced response in Pakistan, and the government, from your perspective, is struggling in the absence of responsibility sharing. You've lived in the UK for quite a while now, and you've got a lot of experience of living and working in Kakuma. What do you wish people could really better understand about life in Kakuma that they struggle to understand when you try to tell them about it here?
Yeah, I think so many things. In short, refugees in the refugee camps do not have access to the right information. Okay, and that is brought by lack of so many things. You know, be it technology, they don't have access to. Only a few have mobile phones, so they don't know what is going on over the world. And picking on what Summia just said, having lived in the UK, I know that I'm living in a society where everybody knows about forced migration. People know who a refugee is. I was in Tokyo in 2021 for the Olympics, and Japanese do not know who a refugee is. Only a few. So there's lack of awareness, but in the UK, everybody knows who a refugee is, which is great. But there are so many other things that are assumed because, when you donate to a charity today, assuming that you're going to help a refugee, it's fine. It's fine. When a refugee comes, after you've give your donation, coming to ask you again, you get tired of that, and that is what I'm seeing here. Influx of so many refugees coming in, the rigidity of governments accepting new drivers of forced migration, because people, I'm a bit, I'm not criticizing, but people talk much about climate change. So if governments or whoever knows that climate change is real, why don't you accept climate migrants? People don't want to accept them. They want to be rigid about that. So there are new drivers for migrations that people need to accept. And we also know that the number of refugees increase every single day. Where are we channeling our efforts to? As organizations, are we helping bringing peace in these countries that need peace? Or what are we actually doing to help? So I think there is wrong effort being channeled. There's effort being channeled to wrong destination or places, or not addressing the real issue of refugees. So that's what I would say. But in saying the population here or the society in the UK, I would say that I am very lucky to be here. And I was very, very happy when the plane that was supposed to take people to Rwanda was stopped. Yeah.
That must surely also be a reflection of ignorance, not necessarily in the general population, but at least amongst some of the political elites. It also leads nicely onto the final question I'd like to ask you both, which goes to the real topic behind today, which is how should we design or redesign responses for people who flee? So, Lam, you highlighted one aspect of reallocating resources to include a focus on underlying causes.
and conflict. You highlighted also that we obviously need to be much less restrictive in the ways highlighted by the Rwanda removals policy. What else should we do? What's working? What's not working? What would you like to change if you were the UN High Commissioner for Refugees tomorrow? What would you try to change?
That's a very hard position to be, because as a UN High Commissioner, you do not have the power to say something. You are dictated by countries that donate money to you. But if I have that power of being able to say, do this and that, I would say that the focus should be channeled in camps. The fact that we have camps that are isolated in places where there is no network, you cannot integrate, you cannot meet a friend, it's absolutely something that I don't know how refugees would get out of there. I was a very lucky refugee because I stayed in Kakuma, and as you see, a small opportunity is very competitive. There are millions of kids that compete for that small scholarship that take you away from the camp. And I was lucky to be part of that lucky people that were out of the camp because of scholarships. So what I would say is I think based on the facts that Paula just presented, we need to know facts. We don't need to, as you say, taking pictures of the lowest, the very people who really suffered. Instead of helping them, first of all, you take the pictures and show the world that these people are hungry. You haven't given them food, you just took the pictures to go and ask for money. First of all, I think there need to be, we need to know what you've done, first of all. You need to show me, yes, with the money I've donated, the family that is in this picture are in this other place right now. They are no longer hungry. I think there need to be transparency on who gives money, how it's used, and the impact. Yeah, I think the impact is what we need to focus on. And when I say the impact, we all need to be involved. We all need to know where we channel our money to. Right?
Fantastic. Thank you. Summia.
Yeah, I think I resonate with a lot what Lam said. And I think confining to camps is a big problem, but also in addition to that, not giving refugees the opportunity to escape the reliance on aid. It's very important that, like through my work, 2 years working through my organization, we provided aid to refugees, Afghan refugees, and now we are evolving and turning into an organization that's more focused on developing programs that are more sustainable in terms of working with the communities that we're working with directly, and developing programs that they would want, that could help them learn the skill sets to work and be actually the ones leading the efforts within their communities. So pivoting more towards education. And the reason for that was precisely because I think this cycle of aid reliance is not helpful, because it disempowers most of these communities, families, and most refugees that I directly work with, and I speak to them, who are living in different parts of the world, and the grassroots partners that we have who are working with them directly, they say that they don't want to be in that position. It's like, right now I just had a conversation on my WhatsApp today with a family that I'm helping in Pakistan, and he messaged me because he wanted additional funding to pay for his rent and to be able to buy food for his family. And he messaged me feeling very embarrassed and emailing and saying, like, I feel extremely embarrassed asking for this, and I would like to pay this back, And to read that email in itself is just so heartbreaking, because the reason why I started the organization was because we wanted to ensure that no one is in that position. But I think reliance on aid and building organizations that focus just on that is not great. I think as a short-term response in times of crisis is great to help refugees, but for long-term solutions, it's important to think beyond camps, to allow refugees to integrate into societies where they can work and live and have the right to work, have the right to education, and have right to citizenship, because that makes a huge difference. The reason for that is, so I left Pakistan as a refugee, and went to the United States. I lived in the United States on a student visa. I came to UK on a student visa. The Taliban took over again. My family is now in the US as refugees, and I'm on a student visa that expires in February. So the only option I have is to seek asylum, because I'm displaced again. So the reason why I share this is because there's just different experience of different refugees. And what we saw with the data and the images and the stories, it's important that we not only look at the data, which is very important to understand, especially looking at income levels of different refugees and what they're experiencing, but also be able to see that visually and to be able to see and learn about their stories in different countries, because different refugees living in different contexts have very different experiences. Lam and I, we have very much different experiences, and I hope that everyone who's here today can take that with them home.
Thank you. That's an important last message to say. There's variety, there's variation, there's different experiences, and we need to avoid homogenizing that experience. Let's open up to you as an audience now. We've just got a little bit of time left for Q&A. If you could introduce yourself briefly, and if you'd like to frame your question for any particular individual, then please do so.
Thank you, Alex and everyone. Marta Foresti. I mostly work on migration, not on displacement, and I sort of listen to some of this with that a little bit in mind. Two quick thoughts and a question. The quick thoughts is to do with design. Alex, you look like a designer today, it's true. And I've been thinking a lot about how we can harness design more to tell a different story about the reality of people on the move. And I'm struck by how much we continue to rely on, as much as we try to overcome numbers and people, we come back to graphs and pictures and videos so much. And really, collectively, there is a lot we can do to use different vocabularies from designs and images to try to overcome that. And in my experience, actually, communities on the move, refugees and migrants that come from the design and creative industries have a lot of ideas on how to do it. So that's just a practical thought. The second, on your misconception issues, Ola, what you showed us about the UN and the bilateral donors. Just to flag, having mostly worked within the aid community, how much backlash there was on using aid to support refugees domestically, and just to be aware that there is real potential for that misconception to get out of control if we bring together the public opinion against aid and misconceptions about refugees. Is really a trend to watch if people underestimate so much how much aid has been put in support of refugees. And then finally is actually a question mainly from Summia, also maybe from Lam, but Summia, you specifically emphasized the importance of recognizing the different experiences that different refugees have. One thing I really worry about when we talk about refugees or migrants for that matter is how much we continue to re-emphasize the otherness. In all our attempts to tell a better story, we continue to talk about others or someone or you and not me. And I really feel that in this work on trying to come up with design ideas and policy, we should try to find more of a continuum of the people who move to really find what makes common experiences, a bit like your own experience in the border of Mexico, while fully recognizing the fact that people have different reasons to move and live different levels of protection, but to really make an effort to think about not just the humanity, but the contribution, the skills, the economic potential of people on the move, a bit on a continuum, a bit like on your Dollar Street, where we can also position ourselves, our friends, and different people who move, and try to be careful not to over-label refugees and forced displacement, and just your opinion on whether you agree or not.
So Summia, I mean, maybe we could offer that question to you. What do you think about the value of blurring boundaries, particularly across sort of refugees, migrants, human beings, and getting beyond the labels?
Yeah, I think recognizing diversity among refugees in no way contributes towards othering another refugee. I think it's important to acknowledge differences because currently when someone says the word refugee, people have certain assumptions in their head about what a refugee is. And from my own personal experience working with refugees, living as a refugee, and traveling in different parts of the world where different refugee communities live, there's just a vast majority of different experiences. I think your point is very important, that it's very important that we think about what connects us and brings us together and why it's important to support us, the refugee community. And I hope through the conversation Lam and I have shared, at least that's what we're trying to do here, that resonates. And I hope there's more opportunities like this for refugees from different backgrounds to come together and speak and share. But I don't think acknowledging and ensuring that organizations, governments, and also civil society recognize that there are disparities even within refugees in any way causes another refugee to be harmed. But actually what we're arguing for is being more inclusive and designing policies and programs according to various needs that exist. And it's very important that we acknowledge that, yeah.
Lam, would you like to add anything?
I think Summia just said everything. The experiences are very different with refugees, but the only thing that we have all in common is the status of a refugee. But the disparity of how different refugees are treated is also something that we have all seen, right? Us from the rest of the world, we've seen that even, that refugees are not the same, although they have the same status, and it's based on how much you know what the reason is, basically understanding or having knowledge about the context in which where refugees come from will give you more knowledge about how you can,
We are a little bit over time, but I'm going to carry on because no one's left. Everyone looks interested and engaged, and there are lots of questions. So I'm going to take a little cluster of questions and then come back to the panelists to answer whichever of them that they would like. So, Jakob.
This doesn't work. All right. Just speak loud. Sure. Oh, so good. Thank you so much. Jakob Oester from Last Mile Climate, a climate adaptation NGO working on in humanitarian contexts. I've worked 10 years in the UNHCR, and what you said, Ola, about the amount of funding that there is in the UN was really interesting, because when I was in Rwanda operation for UNHCR, I did a calculation together with the World Food Programme where we found out that the total amount of funding spent per refugee over the 20-year period that there had been Congolese refugees in Rwanda at the time was $11,000 per person on average, which kind of corresponds very well to
what time unit?
Over a 20-year period. So $11,000 per person over a 20-year period, not adjusted for inflation. But still, it corresponds very well to the $1 per person that you kind of had there. But it's still a large amount of money, even though we're at a very long period. And so my question is to Lam and to Summia maybe, because that corresponds then to $55,000 per household, which is then an even bigger amount of money. And of course, these households had been there for 20 years and they'd been kept alive, but they'd not been given the opportunity to leave the camps. They'd been kept alive, but not given the opportunity to live a life to a very large extent. So my question is to you, hypothetically, Lam and Summia, if back in time when you arrived, and particularly maybe to you, Lam, when you arrived in Kakuma, someone had given your household $55,000
and said, you figure out how to take this money and do the best with it, instead of having been kept. I mean, obviously you're an exception, but and then what would you have done with that $55,000 as a household?
Great. Hold that question. Could you pass it along to your right?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jessie. I'm from Ben & Jerry's. We're doing a lot of activism in this space, and so thank you so much for the discussion today. Ola, this is one for you. We need to destroy some perceptions, particularly your government in Sweden, and it's having an influence all across Europe right now with lots of preconceptions that are not great for refugees. How do we use your data, or how do we use what you do to get to the politicians to change these policies in the UK and in Europe? You said it wasn't academic, but we need to do something and we need to do it quick. So what would you suggest that we do? Or Lam and Ola, if you have, Lam and Summia, if you have suggestions as well, would love to hear it.
And could you pass the microphone 5 places to your right? Testing your maths this evening.
Hi, I'm Alex from the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. And I just saw these figures of the money going to Western European countries versus the money to the UN. So it's quite obvious that the amount per person differs a lot. And then the question comes, okay, but where should I invest my dollar? Should I rather invest it to promote a durable solution in the low or middle income country hosting refugees, or should I spend it to, for instance, finance a resettlement, knowing that maybe the proportion finally is 1 to 10. So I can help one person resettled and bring him, her to Western Europe, or provide livelihood and solutions in the countries they are. So that would mean that basically if you have a group of 10 families, you could have one person of these 10 families going for a resettlement, or rather one person per family to climb the ladder in the country. So question, if that's the choice, what would you think people in that situation would prefer?
And could you pass the microphone immediately behind you for the last one?
Thanks. Is that working? Thank you so much. My name is Nicola Reindorp, and I have the privilege of being the CEO of Crisis Action, which exists to do what you said, Lam, about how to spur more effective action to prevent people having to flee in the first place because of conflict. And first and foremost, I would love to salute that comment and the privilege that I've had in my life of working with incredibly brave and courageous people who've had to flee their homes. And just one or two observations, perhaps, really just to affirm. I think when we look at this amazing title, Designing for People Forced to Flee, designing what and why, that understanding our why is really important. And coming back a little bit to this question that our colleague from the Swiss government, and indeed that great question about why, how do we shift what governments do? One of the things that we use at Crisis Action when we're designing a strategy to figure out what needs to happen right now in Sudan, where tens of thousands of people are fleeing as we speak, or Ethiopia, or thinking about what to do in Lebanon, where 1/4 of the population is a refugee. And it's asking, why does the problem, what's the nature of the problem and why does it exist? Does the situation, do politicians know what the problem is? If so, do we need to describe it? What is the story or the data we need to do? Is it because there isn't a constituency that will reward them for doing so? And we've got to be honest that there are politicians who might want to do the right thing, but actually, where are those constituencies? So how is it we mobilize those constituencies to say there is a political reward for you of choosing to be courageous enough to say $55,000 needs to go to this family now, rather than a drip feed of inadequate response over the next 20 years. A third thing is because we don't have the constituency. We talk about being a good date, like you actually need to link to the issue of the day. Or 4, because there may be vested interests exposed, in which case we need to expose them. So it's being smarter, I think, about the nature of what you said so powerfully here. Where is that we need to give different information because we need to know something different, or where we need to tell stories differently because we need to feel something different in pursuit of designing policies so that we avoid people being forced to flee and when you are forced to flee, that the policies to respond to you actually respond to your needs as they actually are. So more an affirmation of this, and that reminder, keep asking ourselves why and what is it we want to change.
Thank you. 4 challenging questions. Probably give you each a minute to respond to broadly what you want to. But just to get us started, Lan, maybe you could start with Jakob's question. If you imagine your family arriving in Kakuma, would you prefer the big lump sum up front or the staggered drip feed of assistance over time?
Oh, I think he said, if I arrive with my family and I'm given that amount of money, right?
Yeah.
What can I do with it? It depends. It depends on what I'm allowed to do. In Kenya, for example, you arrive as a refugee, you are not allowed to work, you are not allowed to go places, buy commodities. So what can I do with the money? I will just use it and it will finish over time. But if I'm allowed to work, I may start a business, that will sustain me. So it depends on what you are allowed to do as a refugee. I don't know if I answered it well.
That's a great answer. Summia.
For the same question?
If you like, but I was also thinking
yeah.
some of the questions about how we engage politically, how we transform the landscape, and how we change the narrative through data and evidence are exactly what you're doing around the world. So engaging with some of those questions might be of interest, but respond to anything you'd like to.
In terms of how to use, I think what was presented by Ola and Alex, I believe it should be, I was having ideas in my head when I saw it in terms of how data should be used. But I think the combination of data and storytelling, both used together, but ensuring that we are representing refugees from different backgrounds, different countries that live in different contexts is very important. Because what we saw in Kakuma camp in terms of how refugees live, that's very much different than how refugees live in, for example, in Greece, in Lesbos, where I work with certain refugees. The issues that they have is that they, for example, have the right to seek asylum because they're in a European country that has signed the Geneva Convention. But most of the refugee asylum seekers, Afghans who are there seeking asylum, their cases have been rejected, including a lot of them being women. And right now we're trying to reappeal for their cases in Lesbos. One of the cases we had was this girl was going to be sold off. Her father was going to sell her for marriage to one of the other asylum seekers in the camp to be able to have enough money to hire a private lawyer to appeal his asylum case. And so it's very important that in terms of when we think about refugees, we need to really think about not only how to help them, but really think about the foundational thing, which is their ability to have their rights to live their life however they want. And what Lam just said about not having the right to work, not having the right to education, if you don't have legal rights, that has an impact on what you can do. And you cannot, and that's where I've come back with my work. I'm doing a master's in international human rights law and researching about how women and girls from Afghanistan who are trying to seek asylum, how they can be considered as refugees without needing to have to apply for asylum. Because if you're fleeing your home country in the first place and going somewhere and you have to go through this bureaucracy of being able to apply for asylum, find a lawyer, and make a case, that in itself is a very challenging process. So I think having the foundational legal rights is very important for any refugee to be able to live their lives with dignity.
And finally, Ula, I suppose there's one question here about how you can get this data and the brilliant analysis and visualization you offer into the hands of decision makers and politicians to make a difference. And then there's also a question which I think for you is quite provocative, which is about trade-offs. And I know throughout this you're not saying this is where we should draw the line, this is how we should engage with the trade-off. But you're making the trade-off transparent and visible.
Yeah.
I'm interested in how you might respond to the question of trade-off.
Trade-off, I heard it as return on capital, like investment, return on investment, like what do I want to achieve? And I'm looking at you in the front, and then your question was related. I think these questions are extremely hard to answer very quickly, but if you try, you end up, we have some reference frames. We believe in human rights, right? So we are very disturbed when we see refugees in difficult situations, and we want to help. And then we believe in our own goodness, and we want to grab resources and help. But the resources we grab from our taxpayers need to be motivated in a democracy. So if you claim that the Swedish government is doing the wrong thing, the Swedes elected them, right? It wasn't my fault. Now they do what the Swedes wanted. And I believe in democracy, so I should kind of support it, but I don't. So the idea that we should have politicians who make decisions that are actually not what the people want is anti-democratic in one sense. So I'm sorry, the Swedes turned around against immigrants as always in general, because they use the word immigrant and refugee as interchangeable, even if it's absolutely not. So the accountability of like, why are we spending the money where we spend it, often ends up being signaling, virtue signaling, like we want to appear as good, right? So it all comes down to how can this be portrayed as a good investment rather than an effective, cost-effective investment. Like, well, people saw all these crying children from this place, so we as a government want to go up in front of the cameras and say that now we put money where those crying children are, so we help them. They never look at the stats and say, well, there are actually more crying children over there that you're unaware of, so we took all the budget there instead, and we have less, these crying children, they are so few, and they're not crying for starvation, they cry for other reasons. Like, you never hear that. You never hear a rational argument when politicians confront media. So my answer is that's why we work with public education and statistics only. It's the missing piece. When I test politicians, they score worse than monkeys, often worse than the public. So then the journalists are supposed to check their knowledge, but they don't, because the journalists also score worse than monkeys on these facts. So that's why we set up the Gapminder Foundation, saying we live in the first era with statistics. There was never data. Like 50 years ago, there was so little data. Now we have numbers for everything. Nobody sit down and learn them, except me maybe, and Alex maybe, and a few. When we are forced to learn, so required learning for the people working in your organizations to make sure that when you sit at the table, you know, okay, we can do this thing, which is virtue signal for the media, or we can do this thing, which is rationally the right thing to do with our money. Then we're going to have to argue for that, because everyone else is going to be wrong about the facts. But you should have that as a conscious decision. Today, I think in politics and in organizations, in the UN, these decisions are not made consciously. In business, I've been in business. I lecture a lot at businesses. They are cold-minded. They look at data and say, let's invest there. We're going to earn a lot of money. And then the media comes and they are angry, right? Like, did you say Ben & Jerry's? Yeah, like a business. Smart thing. Goodwill, branding, and it works. People love it. Smart decision by people who also want to do something good. To have the data today, the data exists in databases and in reports, but when I check the staff of the organization who publish the data themselves, they usually score worse than monkeys. That's why I was truly surprised by this audience. Annemeke and Alex know that my whole preparation for this talk today was based on the assumption that you were going to score worse than monkeys. And I was going to show that to you, to make you humble and curious to learn more. You were slightly better than monkeys. That's great. So I would love to talk to you to see how that actually happened. I'm very surprised. In general, that's not the case. In most organizations and governments, people are extremely wrong about the basic facts, and they act on emotions and signals instead of doing the math. Even though they are putting billions of dollars to use somewhere, it's still emotionally driven in most cases. Like you see with all these aid resources, the people are surprised that they used a part of the public budget for something, and it just happens, and the public in general were unaware of it based on how they answer my question. I thought everybody knew it, because everybody around me know it. But testing the public knowledge and the politicians and making it required to learn the stuff before we discuss them is what I'm trying to contribute. If it has an effect in the short term, I'm very humble. So far, I think we have had very little impact on actual decisions, unfortunately.
We've gone horribly over time, and that's entirely my fault as moderator, but I was enjoying this panel so much and learning so much that I had to continue with it. So I hope you also took a lot from it. I think there are some key messages that come out. That we are systematically ignorant and misinformed about refugees around the world. And the exception to that appears to be in this room, which gives you an additional responsibility to disseminate evidence and to provide support for a platform for people with lived experience. We've suggested on World Refugee Day that we need to rethink aspects of the current refugee response, policies, programs, that there seems to be, from what we've heard, a misallocation of resources and a lack of thought and evidence and engagement with lived experience behind that. The challenge is to ensure that we can design better tools to get evidence and data into the hands of powerful decision makers, to engage those with lived experience and see lived experience as part of that evidence alongside quantitative and qualitative research, and ensure that we challenge power and challenge interests through evidence and lived experience. Thank you, everyone, and particular thanks to Lam, Summia, and Ola.